Hello and welcome to the second session of our series, The Web of Life. So in the first session, we said that there have to be better ways to understand the world around us. Right? For this, we need to look at life in all its interconnectedness, systemically, rather than in fragments or parts. This will also influence and inform the way we respond to changes. The systems view of life approach, which sees life as a network of relationships, was discussed. In this session, we will try and understand our own food web using this framework. Have you ever asked yourself, where does my food come from? How does it get from the field to my fingers? So I explored these questions with a group of 13 to 14-year-olds over a period of a year. We started by keeping a diary of what we eat every day, found out the recipes, traced all the ingredients as far back as possible to see where they came from. We created a map of how far back we could trace the ingredients. More often than not, we hit a dead end at the grocery store or the wholesale market where the grocery store owner bought the item. In the case of fruits, the children were actually quite shocked to hear that some of the fruits they ate came from Afghanistan or South Africa or the US. The children were surprised at how great the distance was between them and where their food was produced. What was also surprising was that they could not find out details about where many of their regularly used items like pulses, dals, some spices were grown. Now in mapping this, what we were doing was actually drawing a network of relationships. What do we eat? What is it made up of? Where do we buy each item or get it from? Sometimes you might be growing your own vegetables at home, so then you get it from your vegetable garden. How does it get to the grocery store or supermarket, etc.? As our discussion continued, several questions emerged. Who grows it? Who produces these items? How are they grown? Where are they grown? Where do the seeds come from? How much water do you need? Land, fertilizers, energy, how much of all that is needed? How do farmers get these resources? Why does the price of items vary throughout the year? How does it get from the field to the shop and then to our fingers? Now, of course, between the shop and the fingers, there is the act of buying, there is the act of planning what to cook, how to cook it, and then actually cook it. So do you see this network of relationships behind the simple question, where does my food come from? Now, each of us are nested, not just in our families and households, but also in the larger social, political, economic, and ecological system. And I'm going to show you the same slide that I shared with you in the first session, which just to remind us of that nested system framework that we were talking about. But then you might ask, why should we know all this, right? What is the purpose? So to respond to this, I'm going to untangle our food web a little bit more. It's always useful to do this through a story, and everything we eat has a story. So here's a slide on the milk story. Okay, how does the milk come from the cow or the buffalo to your home? So let's trace that story, right? So there are small farmers, okay, who have maybe 1 or 2 animals, and they collect the milk from there. They milk the animals. That milk is brought to some cooperatives. From those cooperatives, it is then sent either to milk parlors or to supermarkets. And those of you, say for example, living in Tamil Nadu would have seen Avin, in Kerala it's Milma. These are government cooperatives, right? Then there are private operators. So these small farmers also send their milk to the private operators. Now the thing is that why do they send their milk to all of these cooperatives as well as private operators? Because the milk has to be processed. But if you want to get fresh milk, it comes straight from the animal, and that happens if either you have your own animal or there is a dairy nearby or there are farmers nearby your house who bring you fresh milk, right? Now in all of these cases, there is a factor of transportation. So the small farmer has to, either by cycle or by motorcycle or whatever, some vehicle will have to take it to the nearest collection point, right? Then there are also large farmers or large dairies, which many of these large dairy and milk companies have, the private dairy and milk companies. So that's another source. So eventually, depending on what brand you buy, right, you will either get the milk from one of these large dairies, or you will get the milk from the small farmers. But it's very important to note that about 75 to 80% of the milk we consume comes from small farmers, not just in India, but in many countries in Africa and also in some countries in Latin America. Okay, so now in addition to what we're seeing on this slide, there are other hidden connections, right? For example, there is a network of relationships between farmers, the land, water, soil, animals, climate, the knowledge of what animals to use for milking and what not, how to take care of the animals, the experience. So that's another relationship, right? And then there is a relationship between farmers, the state, government. The government may give some kind of support, with banks, with money lenders, with their own markets as well, their community, their livelihoods. And then between the choices you and I make on whether we consume dairy products or not. You could be vegan and you may not consume dairy products. Or what kind of dairy products you produce, what brand of dairy products we consume, right? So all this impacts and is related to the life of the farmer and the milk story. So you see there are a lot of hidden connections. So now recently there has also been a strong push to move away from animal-based foods, including dairy, as an action to reduce global warming. Scientific data has shown that modern industrial methods of producing milk and meat are contributing significantly to global warming. So a quick diversion here to define what is meant by modern industrial methods. Right? So we produce meat or milk on a very large scale, on large tracts of land, plenty of resources are needed, large number of animals are reared, not just for meat, but also for milk. Then you need automation, because you have milking machines, right? Then you also use synthetic fertilizers and pesticides to grow fodder and feed for the animals. Many of these animals are fed on soya and corn as well as part of their feed. And of course, plenty of water and labor. So, and this system also includes processing, packaging, refrigeration or what is called a cold chain, transportation over long distances so that everyone can get all kinds of dairy and meat products throughout the year. For each of these stages that we've talked about, we need a lot of energy. If it's transportation, you need fuel. If it's automation, you need some form of energy. Electricity, of course, is central. And how do you generate that electricity? Right? So even today, our main sources of energy continue to be coal, oil, and gas. And all of these, when they are burnt to produce the energy, release carbon dioxide, which contributes to global warming. Now, this is of course very different from the methods used by small and dairy livestock farmers, who even today, like I said earlier, produce 75 to 80% of our dairy requirements. They usually operate with 2 to 3 animals. They use family labor or their own labor. Animals are typically grazed on grasslands and nearby forests if that is available. Their feed is typically, either locally purchased or if they're part of cooperatives, sometimes the cooperatives also make the feed. They have a very intimate relationship with their environment because they're so dependent on that environment, whether it is land, water, flora, fauna, and the animals. And they have knowledge based on lived experience about how to cope under different conditions. But with the increasing dominance of this industrial food system and changing economic and development priorities the world over, their land, their water, resources are seriously threatened. And their vulnerability to changing and uncertainty of climate is also increasing. Now let's come back to what I was talking about earlier, the global push to move away from animal-based foods, right? If we were to look at this as a solution to the problem of global warming through our systems framework, we can see that this will impact the lives of small farmers, pastoralists, and others whose livelihoods come from these animals. The ecosystems where diversity of flora and fauna has been shaped by animals grazing there, by them leaving their dung behind, by the effect on the soil of hoofed animals. There is research available which shows that because of the movement of hoofed animals, soil actually gets loosened and water is able to percolate. The milk and meat from the animals raised by these small farmers is a rich and also essential source of nutrition for many of these communities who are seriously nutritionally compromised. So the socio-ecological network of relationships gets impacted. The response will therefore need to be much more nuanced and context specific. So we cannot have a uniform global strategy of reducing milk and meat consumption. It will have to depend on the context. At this point, let's shift scales a little bit, right? Let's go from the local to the global and get a larger picture of this network of relationships and understand some hidden connections. So here's a slide that I'm going to present to you of hidden connections. Now, as we discussed, right, the emissions from the food system contribute to global warming. That influences climate change. Now, emissions, what are these emissions? They are from field preparation, from harvesting operations, transportation, refrigeration, processing, several other industrial operations. Then large tracts of tropical forest land, particularly rainforests, whether it is in India, parts of Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Latin America, the Amazon rainforests, they are cleared for agriculture, as well as for large-scale cultivation of animal feed, palm oil, which is the single largest source of edible oil in the world, right? I mean, which is used so extensively the world over. And if you want cheap palm oil, you have to cultivate vast areas of palm oil, which means you clear vast forests. Then for the sugar industry, corn is a source of feed and sugar is used as corn syrup, right? And the sugar that you get from corn, right, is corn syrup, which is used in processed foods. Now, if we look at the Amazon rainforests, or if we look at the tropical rainforests in Asia, we can see how they have to be cleared, and in order for them to be cleared in large scale, they are burnt. So what happens is there is loss of the carbon dioxide, which is absorbed by vegetation through the process of photosynthesis. So that is lost when we clear the forests. There's no more vegetation to capture carbon dioxide. And then when you burn these forests to clear the land, you're also releasing carbon dioxide, right? So there is an aggravation literally of the global warming process because of the buildup of carbon dioxide. The other thing that's happening, as we see in the figure, is it leads to loss of habitat, which affects biodiversity. And the web of interdependent plants, animals, insects, birds, microorganisms, which break down all this dead plant material to release nutrients. Now that has another implication, which is that these forests are actually natural firewalls. Like you have firewalls in your computer to protect you from viruses, these natural firewalls actually protect us from viruses which reside in animal hosts. And when we clear these forests, the viruses jump from these reservoirs of animal hosts to human beings. Loss of trees also prevent water vapor building up in the atmosphere, and so that affects precipitation. Now, when rainfall reduces, it leads to water scarcity. Then how do we protect ourselves from infections? I mean, just think about it. For our protection from the pandemic, we had to wash our hands extensively. For that, you need water. So when you have water scarcity, how are you going to do something like that, right? So there are these deep interconnections that we can see. Now, with the processes of the Earth system, okay, if you look at global warming or freshwater resources or biodiversity, they are impacted quite severely. And the urgency to change the way we produce and consume food must be very evident to you by now, isn't it? So visualizing this food system through the systems view of life framework also shows us that there are networks of relationships within and between each system. So once again, we come back, there's individuals or households who make food choices from a given set of options. Now, how are those options shaped? By the economic policies, by political processes, social, cultural systems, because that's what defines what we eat. All of this is embedded, right, in the larger ecological and earth system. And that is the foundation on which the human food web is built, right? So I would like to then share with you just one more network of relationships, just so that we begin to understand this embedding in a slightly different way. So what does this figure do? It looks like a complex figure, but basically what it's trying to do, it's telling you that your dietary choice, your and my dietary choice, how is it connected to various other systems? Policies, politics and power, inequalities in society, caste, class, all of that presents to each of us very different options to choose from. Depending on your socio-economic background, right, the choice that is available to you of food is very different. because it affects the availability directly, okay? It affects the affordability. Depending upon where you are in the socio-economic scale, you can only afford certain kinds of food. Now, if it is affecting availability and affordability, obviously it is affecting your ability to access food. So each of us actually is able to access food very differently, and it is dependent on where we are embedded in these nested systems. The question we asked in the beginning, where does my food come from, is not so simple after all. If you recollect from our discussion on water scarcity in the first session, we talked about how consuming less water demanding foods can have an impact on water scarcity. So our discussion here is intimately connected with the example in the previous session. Finally, let me say that this discussion was not really meant to overwhelm us about the food choices we make, but it is really to get us to be aware and possibly more thoughtful about our life choices. And as we wrap up, I'd like to suggest to all those who are watching this video, do try and draw a network of relationships between the ongoing farmers' protests in India, which started in November 2020, and our food web, and see what emerges. So like always, we will just take a quick look at what we can take away from this session. First one is that it's a simple question: where does my food come from? And look what it can unravel, right? It can unravel a series of hidden relationships on how food reaches us. Then the second point is that a systems view of this food web, it allows us to appreciate the multiple dimensions of the food system, how vibrant and rich it is also. It helps us to understand the relationship between various elements of the industrial food system and the socio-ecological and economic dimensions. It also helps us understand how our choices are shaped and influenced by multiple factors. In actual fact, we think that we are choosing what we eat, particularly those of us who are more privileged. But our choice is embedded in the surrounding systems that we are a part of. So what this nested systems approach allows us to see with clarity is these interrelationships. Thank you.